Greetings, everyone. My name is Captain Crusoda, and if you know me, you know how much I love Stasis. I've always been a sucker for ice magic, and if a game has an elemental magic system, gods know I'm going to gravitate to the ice magic skill tree. Of course, that would have to include the Stasis subclasses in Destiny 2 as well. However, the ice magic in Destiny 2 is some of the weakest ice magic I've used since Skyrim, and I would like to propose a fix. In this fix, I want to tear this element down and use the bricks left behind, as well as some of my own, to fix this atrocity. This is Melancholy's Total Stasis Revamp. Starting us off, Bungie, if you are watching, I know how much you love identity. I know you crave it so badly, you'll break subclasses, for better or worse, just to get it. So I'd like to start with the philosophy behind this new Stasis element. After you complete the Lightfall campaign, you're able to interact with 5 vials, one with each element, in the same room you can buy Strand subclass perks in. What he says about Stasis is that it's the element of will and control. Control over the self can foster over others, but without power over the self, destruction runs wild. When we wield Stasis, we must exercise the ultimate authority over both self and others. This philosophy sounds like it fits in theory, but in practice, this doesn't seem to be the case. I plan on changing that. Starting us off is the verbs. This new Stasis will have 5 verbs, 3 offensive, 1 defense/support, and 1 pickup. This makes Stasis the subclass with the second most amount of verbs, seconded to Void with 7. Starting with the 2 returning verbs, we have Slow and Freeze. These 2 will work no different than how they act now, except the freeze duration in PvE will be significantly longer, and the duration in PvP will be only a smidge longer. Shatter will still remain in a functionality, but will no longer be considered a verb as you cannot build into it, and will just remain a way to finish off frozen targets. But the final third verb, or noun in this case, will be a way to spread Slow and Freeze, which current day Stasis severely lacks. This new verb is Ice Fog. Ice Fog is a cloud of frozen air. This cloud is hard to see through, and enemies caught in this cloud are slowed and eventually frozen. If you've been on Europa, you've seen it near the snowstorms that come with Europa's dynamic weather. How dark the screen gets in a Europa sandstorm is how dark your screen will get in an ice fog. And just to clarify, yes, your head has to be in an ice fog for it to work, so if the ice fog only comes up to your waist, you'll be fine. Next up, we have our defense/support verb, that being a buff that was shown off in the Beyond Light Vidoc that we never got in-game, that being Crystalline Guard. The way it works in PvP is that it takes more or less damage depending on the damage type. So the damage resist is comparable to Woven Mail against Void and Strand damage, has DR comparable to Void Overshields, which I consider the default damage resist value when it comes to overshield buffs against Stasis and Arc damage, and has no damage resist, and goes down like your normal shields do against solar and kinetic damage. I don't know if I want this extended to PvE because I don't want this verb to be rendered irrelevant in activities with, say, Fallen or Cabal enemies, for instance. But for right now, let's just say that it does. Lastly, we have the elemental pickup, which will be, you guessed it, stasis shards. Stasis shards are pieces of pure stasis energy left behind that track to your position. Picking up this shard grants melee energy. Stasis shards are made by slowing and freezing targets, with some targets making more shards than others. Only 10 shards can be made at a single time before there's a cooldown of 5 seconds. For this cooldown, I imagine there'd be an internal timer of 1 to 2 seconds every time you generate a stasis shard, which, in addition to resetting the timer, creates a counter that goes up every time you generate a stasis shard. If that counter reaches 10 before the timer runs out, There's a cooldown of 5 seconds where you can't make any more stasis shards. As for how many stasis shards you generate, minor enemies generate 1 shard, majors, champions, and enemy guardians make 2 shards, and ultras and bosses create 3 shards. Before we move on to the subclass changes, I'd like to make a pit stop to talk about some weapon changes, starting with legendary stasis weapon perks. Here we have 2 perks that will go unchanged, 1 perk that will need it to be replaced, and 1 new weapon perk that I made myself. The 2 perks that will go unchanged in functionality are Kill Clip and Cold Steel, with the only change being that we're going to make more stasis swords, because Cold Steel was made, put onto 1 holiday weapon, and never used again. As for the perk we're replacing, we will be replacing Headstone with a perk called Creeping Chills. Precision kills with this weapon send out a thin ice fog, sawing combatants caught in it. As for the ice fog cloud, just imagine the shockwaves from necrotic grips, but they slow instead of poison, and blue instead of green. Lastly, the new perk is called Recycling Rounds. Collecting stasis shards gradually reloads this weapon. I imagine these rounds will not come from your reserves, since you're getting the ammo from the stasis shards. Real quick, before we move on into exotic weapon perks, I want to talk about the state of stasis crystals. I just went ahead and removed them entirely with one exception, since they didn't really contribute to the subclasses other than providing cover. I say this since, well, yes, they can be shattered to deal damage around the area. Base shatter damage is minuscule if they are not already frozen, and if they're not going to make any worthwhile contributions to the subclass, might as well get rid of them entirely. This also works as a segue into our exotic weapon changes, and we're only going over the changes that actually matter, since Cryosthesia, Aggers, Conditional, and Winterbite deal with slowing and freezing/shattering, and the only worthwhile change is with Wicked Implement, and that we're replacing Headstone with Creeping Chills, which we're doing with the legendary weapons already. That leaves us with 2 exotic weapons that require a base change. The exotic bow, Verglass Curve's intrinsic perk, will go unchanged. However, the exotic perk will need a replacement. In this iteration, direct hits with stasis arrows freeze combatants and slow opposing guardians. Stasis arrows that impact the environment create a thin ice fog that gets wider depending on how many stasis arrows you have stacked. If you want a diagram that shows how wide the ice fogs will be, sorry to say, I don't have anything for you. Just use your imaginations and then argue in the comments about how wide you think the ice fog should be. I say this as a joke, but please talk amongst yourselves. Just be sure to keep it civil. The second exotic weapon to see a drastic change is the exotic heavy grenade launcher, Salvation's Grip. Using the normal tap fire lobs a grenade that deals heavy damage and shatters frozen targets. Holding the fire button releases canisters that release an ice fog. This ice fog will be just tall enough to cover a guardian, so you can use this to freeze an entire room or as a smokescreen to use as an escape. Speaking of which, I want to make a point that I didn't get to make in the ice fog description. Vanishing in an ice fog is like vanishing with void invisibility. Since combatants can't see you, they'll target the last place they saw you. In this case, if you put down an ice fog to avoid enemies shooting at you, if they don't see you leave, they'll keep shooting the ice fog until they notice you again. Just be sure to keep your head down while you make your getaway. Now I want to move on to the subclass changes, starting with the subclass non-specific changes. So these will be the grenade abilities and the fragments. This new Stasis subclass will have the 3 grenades to start, so I would like to see more added in the future. Starting off with the returning grenade, we have the Ice Wall grenade. Remember when I said we're moving stasis crystals with one exception? This is it. This new Ice Wall grenade will create a wall of stasis spikes like they do now, except you can now hold the grenade button to aim it, and use mouse 1 to rotate it counterclockwise, and mouse 2 to rotate it clockwise. The Ice Wall grenade will also have a brief delay between making contact with the surface and deploying. This is to mimic the phenomenon of Titans putting up a barricade to escape an encounter, but dying just before the barricade goes up to discourage using it as a get out of encounter free card. Next is the Deposition Grenade. Is Deposition being used correctly here? I'll let you decide. This is a grenade that attaches to targets and freezes not only the target it's stuck to, but also all other enemies around them. However, if it makes contact with the surface instead, it will slow all affected combatants instead. The tracking on this grenade will have the same functionality as the tracking as the Flux Grenade on Arc, with faster throwing speed but reduced tracking. And lastly is the Blizzard Grenade. Throw a canister that spews stasis gas, creating an ice fog and limiting visibility. There's no way around it. This is a smoke bomb, plain and simple. For as simple as the functionality is, this is actually the one I'm most proud of, since it's the one that made me consider ice fogs as a verb, or noun, and made this revamp possible. Next on the docket are the fragments. Here we have 6 unchanged fragments, 5 altered fragments, and 5 new fragments, bringing us up to 16 fragments like on the revamped light subclasses, and not like the 14 fragments current day Stasis and Strand have. First, let's just lightning round the unchanged fragments. So these are whispers of hedrons, refraction, bonds, impetus, fractures, and torment. Those out of the way, let's first talk about the fragments that will return, but altered in a way to fit this new element. First is Whisper of Whine. Instead of getting a stacking overshield, now you're granted a stacking counter that goes up when you pick up a stasis shard. Upon finishing this encounter, you're automatically granted a Crystalline Guard overshield. This fragment comes with a 10 resilience detriment. Current day Rime already gives you an overshield, so why not replace it with a Crystalline Guard overshield instead? Second is Whisper of Hunger. Grant more melee energy and Rime stacks when picking up a stasis shard, and this comes with a 10-point detriment to mobility and recovery. This fragment has been altered to also work with Whisper of Rime, bringing down the stasis shard requirements from a hypothetical 10 shards down to 8. Third is Whisper of Durance. Slow and freeze from your abilities last longer. This comes with a 10 strength bonus. Now, when you freeze your target with your Deposition Grenade, Ice Fogs, or any of the abilities that we'll talk about in the subclass specific changes, they'll last just a few seconds longer. This may seem a little strong, but given that you needed to use a fragment slot for it, I think it'll be fine. Fourth is Whisper of Chains. While you're inside of a friendly ice fog, you take less damage. This comes at a bonus of 20 recovery. This will have the same damage resistance of current day chains, but with the removal of stasis crystals, we do what we did with the other abilities involving stasis crystals and simply replace them with ice fogs. Fifth and final for the altered fragments is Whisper of Rending. Your primary weapons do more damage to frozen targets and targets in an ice fog with no stat differences. As stated earlier, we're simply replacing the functionality for stasis crystals in favor of ice fogs. Next, we get to move on to my favorite part, the fragments I made myself for the subclass, starting with Whisper of Smoke. This increases the duration of ice fogs you create with a 10 discipline detriment. This one is simple. If you make an ice fog, it sticks around longer. It's as simple as that. Second is Whisper of Burden. Your stasis abilities apply more slow stacks. This comes with a detriment to 10 discipline and 10 strength. If you're asking how this differs from Durance, to put it simply, Durance makes enemies slowed for longer amounts of time, Burden freezes faster. Third is Whisper of Protection. Your Crystalline Guard lasts even longer. This comes with a 10 resilience detriment. Once again, if your abilities give you a Crystalline Guard overshield, it stays around for a longer amount of time. Fourth is Whisper of Greed. You make even more stasis shards from abilities with a detriment to 10 strength. Now minor combatants make 2 shards, mages, champions, and enemy guardians make 4 shards, and ultras and bosses make 5 shards. Fifth and final is Whisper of Frost. Dealing damage with your melee ability grants energy to your grenade, melee, and class abilities. Melee kills also grant a small amount of super energy. This comes to a detriment of 10 strength and 10 class ability stat. So 10 resilience for titans, 10 mobility for hunters, and 10 recovery for warlocks. Next we get to delve into the subclass specific changes. We'll cover the abilities the way they're displayed on the subclass screen. So starting with the super ability, moving on to the class abilities, jump abilities, melee abilities, and finally aspects, and we'll be wrapping up the subclass changes by going over Stasis exotic armor changes. For the subclass changes, we have one that's seen buffs but is unchanged for the most part, one that's been relatively unchanged but has seen some drastic enough of changes to be considered a revamp, and one that's had the foundation ripped out from beneath it and rebuilt from the ground up. So let's start with the subclass with the most drastic changes. The new Stasis Titan subclass is called Lancer. The super is called Fimbulwinter Frost. Throw a massive javelin into a surface. This javelin will pass through enemies and make an ice fog field on contact and will occasionally send out shockwaves to shatter frozen targets. Barricades and lift abilities have seen no changes. The new melee is called Throwing Lance. Throw a lance of stasis energy. Enemies hit with this lance directly get frozen, while enemies indirectly hit get slowed. Kinda like the charge shot from Cryosthesia. For the aspects, we have two that go unchanged, one revamped ability, and one new aspect. Cryoclasm and Diamond Lance have seen no changes, and will function as they do in current day Destiny. The third aspect is called Shiver Glide. Press and hold your air move key while in the air to leap and glide through the air. Releasing makes you dash forward. This is no longer a melee ability, so it won't consume your melee energy, instead having a cooldown based on your mobility stat. However, since it's no longer a melee ability, the ability to hit an enemy with this to launch and slow them have been taken away. I know, I love launching enemies too, but it's for the best. Finally, we have the new aspect called Ice Magnet. Passing through a friendly ice fog grants you and allies that pass through ice fog you created a Crystalline Guard overshield. One more thing I wanted to add before we move on. It's clear that Bungie wants each subclass to have their own niches, only to essentially chicken-hole them into that role. Though they've been doing a good job of avoiding this with Strand, I will make each Stasis subclass able to use all the new Stasis kit has to offer. With that out of the way, we have the exotic armor changes. The Diamond Lance generation from Cadmus Ridge Lance Cap will see no change, although Diamond Lances will now make thin ice fogs upon contact. Likewise, while Icefall Mantle will go relatively unchanged, there are some changes I'd like to make. First, the overshield is now a Crystalline Guard overshield, and you will no longer have a movement penalty. To counteract this, the overshield now uses all barricade energy with no cancellation, and it can now only be used on the Lancer subclass. I feel this is a decent trade-off. Lastly is the exotic chest piece Hoarfrost Z, which has seen the most drastic change. While using the Lancer subclass, your rally barricade will have an ice fog around it. Allies standing in your ice fog will gain increased stasis ability regeneration. Since stasis abilities are among the slowest charging abilities in the game, I opted to give the subclasses ways to counteract this weakness. Next is the Stasis Warlock subclass called Fog Runner. I don't like the name, but it's the best we got, and I'm open to suggestions. The super is called Rolling Avalanche. Activate your super ability to summon a stasis staff. While your super is active, your super primary attack will generate an ice fog beam wherever you're aiming, and your super secondary attack releases a shockwave with your staff, shattering frozen targets. This functions relatively the same as current day Winter's Wrath does. just with an ice fog instead of those weird stasis bolt things. Rifts and glide abilities will go unchanged. The melee is called Smokescreen. Hold your melee ability to conjure a small ice fog wherever you're pointing. Hitting an enemy with this cloud directly will freeze them. Using this ability drains your melee instead of using it all instantly. Quitting your melee ability early will stop draining your melee. Also, hitting an enemy with this ability directly will freeze them faster than if they were to just stand in the fog afterward. Moving on to the aspects, once again, we have 2 that are unchanged, 1 revamped aspect, and 1 new aspect. Bleak Watcher and Ice Flare Bolts will remain unchanged. Frost Pulse will keep its functionality of freezing nearby enemies upon rift cast, but now you and your allies inside your rift will gain a Crystalline Guard Overshield so long as you're standing in your rift. Lastly, we have the new aspect called Gift from Ice. Allies standing in your rift or in ice fogs you create will gain increased stasis ability regen. Like the Hoarfrost Z change, this once again hopefully counteracts this slower ability regen. Lastly is the exotic armor changes. Winter's Guile will remain functionality, but targets frozen by your smokescreen ability directly, as in with the beam itself, will automatically shatter like it does with Penumbral Blast today. Next is the exotic gauntlets, Valador Wrathweavers, which will also retain functionality, except allies in range of your shockwave will gain a Crystalline Guard Overshield in addition to that increased stasis weapon damage. I wanted to make Wrathweavers worth using, and I think this will do the trick. Lastly, we have the subclass that's gone relatively unchanged, that being the Revenant subclass for the Hunter. Silent and Squall will see no change, except the Stasis Tornado will have an ice fog around it, and the tornado itself will shatter frozen targets. Jumps and dodges will remain unchanged, as will the melee ability Withering Blade, except I'd like to buff the damage significantly and the travel speed by a small but noticeable margin. For the aspects, now there's 1 that's gone unchanged, and 2 that have been altered alongside the new aspect. The 1 aspect that's gone unchanged is Shatterdive. Funny enough, I actually considered not bringing Shatter back, but this is the aspect that made me change my mind. The first aspect that's seen a change is Winter's Shroud. Dodging slows nearby targets. Slowing targets grants grenade and class ability energy. And no, that doesn't only apply to targets slowed by the dodge ability, but will also apply to Withering Blade slows, Ice Fog slows, the whole shebang, so go nuts. The second aspect to see a change is, of course, Touch of Winter. This needed to see a change since we have new grenades. The Deposition Grenade now explodes twice, with the second explosion shattering the frozen targets. The Stasis Spikes from the Ice Wall Grenade now have higher damage resistance and deploy faster after hitting a surface, but they expire faster. Finally, the Ice Fog Smokescreen from the Blizzard Grenade now highlights targets through the ice fog. However, the highlights go away while aiming down sights and return after aiming. This is a good time to bring up the fact that if your weapon's scope highlights targets, it'll highlight enemies through the ice fog like they do in a European snowstorm. Finally is the new aspect, Reach Up, Touch Faith. Shattering frozen opponents drops the special Stasis Shard. Pick up the shard to be granted a Crystalline Guard Overshield. Generating the shard will result in a cooldown of 15 to 20 seconds. Can't have people spamming this Overshield over and over. Finally, for the Revenant changes are the exotic armor changes. Mask of Bacchus will go unchanged, but Renewal Grasp will need to see a change. Your Blizzard Grenades now have a much larger effect radius, and allies inside your Ice Fog take reduced damage, while targets inside the area deal reduced damage. Essentially, they just do what they do for Dustfield Grenades in modern day D2, minus the Stasis Crystal in the center. Now, obviously I can't playtest these changes. If Bungie could implement player-made servers where we can make these changes for ourselves, like Team Fortress 2 does, I could make my own server today with these changes. Unfortunately, We apparently can't even afford a dedicated servers, so there's no way in hell they can implement player-made servers. So all I can do for now is write down these changes in a Google Doc, make a YouTube video about it, and pray to all the gods and deities in the heavens above that Bungie sees it and at least considers bringing them into the game. However, if you'd like to increase the chances of Bungie seeing this, please drop a like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future. If this does well, and Bungie does somehow see this and does something about it, my life could change, and I would have y'all to thank for it. But for the time being, as of writing this script, it's 3:43 in the morning, and I need some fucking sleep. So for now, I'm gonna head out. Good night.
F2 went free to play. With zero prior announcements or warnings, there was suddenly a massive influx of new players that the pre-existing community servers could not keep up with. And these new players were unlike anything the community had seen before, because they were utterly, hopelessly clueless. When you buy a game, you don't do so.